Age of Sigmar took the concept of old fantasy dwarves and essentially remade them from the ground up in the form of the trade and ranged focused Caradron overlords and the much more Slayer-esque with a little mix of priests and prayers and fire focused force of the Fyreslayers. And today we are taking a look at the latter with the Fyreslayers faction pack review. The Fyreslayers battle traits are focused all around their runes, which is the Urgold rune system, and there are a few of these, but you can only use one of these abilities per battle round. And they do come into effect in different phases though, so you can be quite flexible in how you spread them out, and you can get the one you need the most right when you need it, rather than potentially having to preempt your opponent by having to choose one right at the start of the battle round. So that is quite a nice little quality of life addition to them. They are also once per battle each, so you can't reuse the same rune in a subsequent battle round. So in that respect, they can feel a bit restrictive, but I do think for what they bring, they do have quite a lot of power behind them. The Rune of Fury is the first, and this is the start of any turn. You can pick this and all friendly Fyreslayer units have strike first when they are fighting an enemy that has charged that turn. So this is a really great defensive tool to make sure that any opponent charging you is going to take a lot of damage first before they get to hit you back. You also get the Rune of a Fiery Determination, which is done at the start of any hero phase, and this one gives you essentially an army-wide 5-up ward save for the whole battle round. So if you are going into maybe battle round 2 or 3, where there is likely going to be a lot of combat going on, this could make your entire army much more durable for a round, which really could absolutely swing a few key combats in your favour. The Rune of Farsight is next. This one is done in the shooting phase, and this allows you to pick any enemy units that are within 10 inches of any Fyreslayer units and are visible, and you roll a d3 for each of them, and on a 2+, they take that much mortal damage. So you can potentially chuck out quite a bit of mortal output if you are up close to the enemy, just preparing to maybe make a few charges in, and you want to get as much chip damage in first before you head in. The Rune of Relentless Zeal is next. This is done in your movement phase, and you can do this and you get army-wide run and charge, which is just fantastic. You are not the fastest army in the world with a lot of 4-inch moves, so basically almost doubling that on average rolling is really good, but potentially getting up to an extra whole 6 inches is just huge, and it really does make your melee units much more of a threat to the enemy when you really need them in combat. And then finally we have the Rune of Searing Heat. This is in any combat phase. You can pick this and your melee weapons get the crit mortal rule for that battle round. So this could get you 2 combat phases of crit mortals, and this will of course make you really scary in combat with all your infantry. Overall, these are just a very strong set of traits. I think you can essentially get 5 battle rounds worth of incredibly solid utility, some better movement, some more hitting power, some more durability, anything you need. And I like the fact that this is really quite flexible in when you choose what you want. So you can, as I said, get the ability and power and buff that you really need right when you need it. So I'm a big fan of these traits. I think they are overall pretty damn good. To make it even better though, the 4 formations also help you really focus and play into a specific playstyle, which I do really like and think is very useful. The Warrior Kinbad is your melee focused one. This gives the Berserk Kindred rule, which gives you +1 to your wound rolls in combat when you have charged this turn with an infantry unit. It is nice, it is simple, but it is very strong when you want to be getting into melee anyway. The Forge Brethren are more defensive. This one gives you +1 to your save rolls while your infantry units are wholly within friendly territory. Now remember, friendly territory isn't just your deployment, so this can actually be quite a big area in some games of AOS. So this really can give you a significant boost to your durability, especially in a turn, for example, when you use the Rune of Fiery Determination for that 5-up ward save on top of that improved armor. The Scales of Volcatrix are next, and this one is for your bigger, more monstrous units. It gives a simple 2 extra health to your Magma Droth units, meaning a lot of your bigger, tankier heroes can be rocking around with 16 instead of 14 health, which is a pretty solid increase in their durability. And then finally, we have the Lords of the Lodge. This comes with the passive of a martial pride and stubborn will, and this gives +3 to the control scores of your heroes, and it means their control scores can't be modified by enemy abilities. Now on the face of it, this to me is the least exciting of the four, but it is still very, very useful because you have got such a big number of heroes in your army, and your army will almost all the time have a good number of them in it. So I do think this is going to actually provide more of a benefit than you may think. So there are some armies that only have, a couple of heroes in, and you'd think that's not really worth it. But on the Fyreslayers, this could actually give you quite a good buff to quite a good proportion of your army. But overall, I do think it is still probably the least exciting of the four. You do of course also get the usual traits and artifacts, 3 of each, and starting with the traits we have the Blood of the Berserker, which is a passive giving you +1 to charge rolls for friendly Fyreslayer units wholly within 12 inches of the bearer, so making your slow moving army just that little bit more reliable at getting into combat, and of course comboing very well with things like that warrior kinband formation, which gives you that +1 to wound on the charge. The Ash Bear is the next trait, and this makes a unit a priest if they weren't already, or if they were, it gives you +1 to their chanting rolls, so it just makes them much more reliable, or gives you that extra chanting power from an extra priest if you wanted to just throw a few more prayers around the army if you needed that. And then finally on the traits front is Fiercely Competitive. This is another passive, and it is a hilariously solid way of counteracting some of the buffs that your opponent can get. If this hero is in combat with an enemy unit that has strikes first, then your hero also has strikes first, and if the enemy uses all-out attack, your hero also gets +1 to hit. So if you get charged by 2 units, one of which has strikes first, then of course that enemy unit will get to go first just because of how activations work, but then your hero can swing back before that second enemy unit. And on top of that, getting essentially a free all-out attack whenever the enemy does is super strong, and if nothing else, does potentially save you a command point on using it on your hero yourself. So this is just a really great, fun, all-round useful offensive and defensive trait, I think. On the artifacts front, we start with the Ash Cloud Rune. This is once per battle in the enemy hero phase, you can use this, and then until the start of your next turn, friendly infantry units wholly within 12 inches of the bearer cannot be targeted by enemy shooting attacks. So if you are against a ranged heavy army, this can just be fantastic for keeping your key squishy units alive as you get up the board and into charge range. It is really strong against the right army, but then again, of course, against some armies, it could be completely useless. The draft of the Finest Magmalt is next. This is again once per battle, but it's in any combat phase, and you get +3 attacks to the hero's melee weapons. Now this could be amazing on something like a Rune Father with their Grand Axe doing a flat 3 damage, and could absolutely swing a combat for you when you need it to. So I think this is very, very good despite being once per game. The final artifact is the passive of Drothhelm. This gives you +1 to hit for your companion weapons used by friendly Fyreslayer units wholly within 12 inches of the bearer. And now you do have quite a few companion weapons on some of your heroes on the Magmadroths. So someone on a Magmadroth with a few other heroes on Magmadroths around him could make good use of this and really chunk out a quite scary amount of good hitting attacks into the enemy with this charging up the board and taking on an enemy flank between a couple of them. Overall, I think they're a really solid set of artifacts and traits. I really love the Blood of the Berserker and the Fiercely Competitive traits, and then I think all of the artifacts have at least some use, so there is a really nice selection for you to pick and choose from when you are putting your lists together. Now we get onto the prayers, and then of course there are some manifestations which we will cover at the end of the video, but on the prayer front we start with Prayer of Ash. This is your unlimited prayer and it's chanted on a 4+. It lets you pick a Fyreslayer unit wholly within 12 inches of the chanter, and they are at -1 to be wounded until the start of your next turn. And then if you chant it on an 8+, the enemy is also -1 rend into them. So this can make a unit scarily tanky despite how squishy they look on their war scrolls, potentially being -1 to wound, -1 rend, and with a 5-up ward with your battle trait, this is a really nice prayer to throw around on a few units that you absolutely need to keep alive. The Prayer of Grimnir's Fury is also chanted on a 4+. This one lets you pick a Fyreslayer hero within 12 inches of the priest, and they get to use 2 fight abilities this turn, albeit with the second one having the strike last rule. On an 8+, they also get +1 to wound for the turn. So again, turning something like your Magmadroth heroes into just absolute monsters. And it really stacks nicely with things like the Draft of Finest Magmalt, which buffs your attacks for the turn. So you would get an extra 6 attacks out of that with this prayer, thanks to using 2 fight abilities. So I think this is a incredibly good prayer to put on something like that Runefather to get a huge amount of highly damaging, potentially really good wounding attacks if you get the +1 to wound off as well. So it can turn something like a Runefather on a Magmadroth into just an absolute terrifying melee monster. The last prayer is the Wrath of Volcatrix. This is again chanted on a 4+, and this lets you pick a Magmadroth unit wholly within 12 inches, and they get to ignore the battle damaged ability for the turn, and also get +1 attack to their companion weapons. So they are not getting that small nerf if they are damaged anymore, they are instead getting a little bit of a buff. And it gets even better on an 8+, where they get +1 attack for every 4 points of damage they've taken. So with just 1 health left, this could put a Magmadroth's attacks from 8 in total all the way up to 14, which really will help them just rip through pretty much anything that you send them into. Again, it's just a really solid all-round buffing lore here, and one that I do think you will be using a hell of a lot if you are running a Fyreslayer army for all of those pretty incredible defensive and offensive bonuses. But now we'll move on to the units themselves, and we will start with the aforementioned Auric Runefather on Magmadroth. He is a hefty 350 points, but he's got a really good profile with a 10-inch move, 14 health, a 4-up save, and a 6-up ward. And he has a really fantastic set of ranged and melee attacks, and some really useful abilities as well. The Roaring Firestream is 10-inch range, but it's got 4 attacks that hit and wound on 3s, which is quite good for a ranged profile, and then it is 1 rend and D3 damage, but also +1 rend against infantry, so it can do a solid bit of work into infantry units before he charges in, but then of course in melee is where his real power lies. His Grand Axe does 4 attacks on 3s and 3s with 2 rend and 3 damage, whilst the Magmadroth, as said above, is really great with 6 attacks from the Claws and Horns that hit on 4s, wound on 2s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and then 2 more attacks from its Maw, which are again 4s and 2s, they are 2 rend and they are a flat 3 damage. So it can do a heck of a lot of work, killing off nearly 10 4-up save, 1 health infantry in combat alone is seriously impressive. He also gets some great abilities, as I said, in Raging Inferno, which is in any combat phase, you pick an enemy unit, and on a 3+ you subtract 1 from their save rolls, making his 1 and 2 rend even more terrifying into even things like 3-up save Chaos Warriors, whilst his once per battle Warrior King's rule gives +1 to the attacks for friendly Fyreslayer units wholly within 12 inches for the turn, so making himself and anything around him just absolutely devastate any enemy they charge into. On top of that, he also gets a bit of token defensive abilities in a way with Volcanic Blood. This just means that if you roll a 1 for his saves, you do 1 mortal damage back onto the enemy unit at the end of the phase, so he can potentially kill off a few more models even after they've swung into him with their own attacks. All in all, he is just a really fast, really deadly, torpedo style unit. I do kind of wish he was a priest too, because that would just make him amazing, but for 350 points I think he can definitely punch up really quite well, and with some of the buffs he can get, he is a really quite terrifying melee threat. The slightly lesser version of this is the Rune Sun on Magmadroth. He is a cheaper 300 points, and he has the same profile but slightly worse melee. He's got 5 attacks instead of 4, but they're only 2 damage instead of 3. They do, however, gain the anti-monster +1 rend rule though, so rend 2 into monsters, which isn't bad, and he can definitely go after them and do a good bit of work into them if that is what is in front of him. He does keep the same volcanic blood rule as the Runefather, but his rampage is instead dominating road, which is used once per turn. At the end of any turn, he can pick a monster he's in combat with, and if your Rune Son has less damage points than the target, you subtract 10 from that enemy monster's control score. So as long as you are not seriously injured, he can potentially steal or flip an objective from your opponent, and that nice 10 control monster that your opponent thought had that objective really safely secured. He also has the Vying for Glory passive, which gives him +1 attacks to his ancestral weapons whenever he kills a monster. This isn't going to net you a huge amount over the course of the game, but as he wants to kill monsters anyway with his other rules and profiles, you are going to be going after them. So this could net you an extra 1 or 2, maybe 3 if you're lucky attacks over the course of a game. So he is definitely a good unit for going after enemy monsters and just gets better and better and better as you kill more of them. He is overall a cheaper, still viable anti-monster variant of the Runefather, and so if you definitely needed to save those 50 points to spend elsewhere, he could well be worth thinking about. The final Magmadroth riding hero is the Rune Smiter. He's in between the two previous ones at 340 points, and again he's got that same 14 health 4-up save profile. He does have the worst melee of the three, with the same Magmadroth attacks of course, but only 4 that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage from his Latch Axe. But in return, he is a priest, which adds a load of potential from his buffing chants and prayers that he can do. His rampage is also really good. It lets you pick a unit in combat with him in any combat phase, and you roll a 2d6, and if the roll is less than the number of models in the unit, they take d3 plus 3 mortal damage. So of course this is pretty bad against smaller cav units or lone monsters, but it's a really solid way to do a good chunk of damage into 10 or 20 man units that he may be crashing into. He also has a hero phase ability, Runic Empowerment. This lets you pick a Fyreslayers unit wholly within 12 inches of him and you roll a dice, and on a 3+, they get +1 to wound for the turn, which is a fantastically strong buff and makes for a really nice combo alongside things like the Rune of Fury or the Rune of Searing Heat, just to make sure you can do the absolute most damage possible into an enemy unit when you need to. The next 3 units we're going to look at are the 3 unmounted versions of these previous 3, so the Runefather, the Rune Son, and the Rune Smiter. The Runefather is 5 health with a 5-up save and only a 4-inch move. He is much cheaper of course with no Magmadroth. He's 160 points, and he keeps the same Latchkey Grandaxe with its 4 3 damage attacks. His War Scroll abilities are a bit different though. Commanding Presence lets you add the battle round number to friendly infantry units' control scores at the end of any turn, so by battle round 4 or 5, giving your friendly units wholly within 12 inches an extra 4 or 5 on their control, which is very nice for flipping those objectives in the endgame. And then Royal Retinue, that lets you once per battle pick a non-hero infantry unit that is in his combat range in the deployment phase, and then for the rest of the battle you get +1 to hit for that unit, and it also has a 4-up ward save when they are wholly within 6 inches of him. So it's a great little durability boost for them, as well as making them that much more accurate when they are all charging into combat together. The Rune Son, likewise, keeps his ancestral weapons, and he also has 5 health with a 5-up save and his 6-up ward. He is also much cheaper at 130 points, but again he's got some new War Scroll rules. Fearless Charge is a passive that gives you +1 to charge rolls for friendly Fyreslayer infantry units wholly within 18 inches of him after he's made a charge, so just making it even easier for all of your subsequent charging units that go in after him to actually make it into combat. He also gets a reaction in Dauntless Assault, which is after you've declared a fight ability with him, he can then pick a non-hero infantry unit in his combat range to fight straight after him. So it's the usual fight with a hero and then fight with a unit that we've seen on a lot of things in 4th edition, but it is just an all-round useful little ability for a hero and their accompanying retinue to have. So for 130 points, he isn't bad. I don't know if he quite does enough when you compare him to the Runefather though, or indeed to the next unit we're going to look at, which is the Rune Smiter. The The Rune Smiter is actually the cheapest of the three, rather than sitting in the middle like he did on his Magmadroth. He's only 120 points, but he does again have the worst melee with his Latch Axe, which is still the same profile as it was when he's on his Magmadroth, and he also has the same 5 health and 5 up save. He is still a priest though, which is great value for a unit to bring some more chance to the army, and he also brings you some relatively useful mobility tools, which is really important on such a slow army. Magmic Tunneling lets you pick this unit and one other in his regiment, and they can be set up underground instead of on the board when you deploy them. And then you can bring them in your hero phase with the emergence rule. This lets you set up the Rune Smiter 9 inches away from enemies, and then you set up the other unit that he's bringing with him 6 inches away from him and also 9 inches away from enemies. The interesting thing about this is that it says it's done in the hero phase, not the movement phase. So technically, this puts you 9 inches away, and then in the subsequent movement phase, you could move your 4 inches and then get an easier charge off. You could get a 5-inch charge off. So unless this gets FAQ'd to say you come in the movement phase, which I think it realistically might, because most of the other rules like this do say movement phase. But at the moment, this looks like it could net you a potential 5-inch charge with this guy and, say, a big unit of berserkers, which could be a really scary alpha strike into an enemy flank. So overall, with this rule as it is now, I would say the Rune Smiter and the Rune Father are just better than the Rune Sun. The Rune Sun maybe might find a little bit more stock if this does get FAQ to, say, the movement phase, but they are all pretty decent, and I do think that they bring some good utility and abilities to your army, especially if you are going infantry heavy and aren't relying on the Magmadroth versions of them. Next up, however, we have the bigger, more powerful priest in the Auric Runemaster. This guy is pricier, he's 190 points, and he does still have that same 5 health, 5 up save, and 6 up ward, but he can chant 2 prayers now instead of 1. His melee is pretty bad. It's 3 attacks that are 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage, but his main use is his chanting, of course, and he plays into that really well with the High Priest of the Zargrim. This means that when you chant a prayer and it's answered, he gets a Magmic power token, and you can then spend these tokens with the Master of the Runes ability. So when you use one of your battle traits, one of your specific Urgold abilities, you can remove 3 Runemaster's Magmic totems, and that Urgold ability gets a fairly nice buff for the turn. The Rune of Fury gains +1 to wound when the units have strike first. The Rune of Fiery Determination gives a flat +1 to saves, not dependent on being in friendly territory. Relentless Zeal gives you +1 to run and charge rolls, making you even more likely to get into combat on that turn that you use it. The Rune of Searing Heat gives you +1 rend to your melee weapons, so now you are going to be crit mortals and +1 rend, which is just a fantastic melee output buff. And then the Rune of Farsight now bumps the ability up from 10 inches to 16 inches, so you can catch potentially a lot more enemy units with it and do a fair bit more mortal damage to them. Obviously this rule does require a little bit of setup because you need 3 Magmic totems, but this can easily get you a buff on at least 1 or 2 of your battle traits that you choose across a game, and it does make them really much more impactful when you use them. So I do think he is still a very good pick for 190 points. He's a 2 chant priest, which is great, and he is, with his other abilities, a really good force multiplier. The Battlesmith is up next. He's got the same 5 health, 5 up save profile. You may have to get used to that. He is a fairly cheap 110 points, and again he is a nice little buff piece. He's got solid melee with 5 attacks on 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage, and he is really useful for improving your control and also improving your healing. He lets you ignore negative modifiers to control scores for friendly units wholly within 12 inches thanks to the Icon of Grimnir, and he also lets you roll 3 extra dice when you use Rally thanks to Bard of the Lodge. So he is just a super all-round useful support piece for those 110 points, and I think he can quite easily make his points back with those 3 extra rally dice alone. So on top of making it easier for you to take and hold objectives, I do think he is just a very good pick. On top of that, as the cherry, he's also got that semi-decent melee as a really nice bonus. The The Grimwrath Berserker is more of an outright combat hero. He's 110 points too, and he's got, again, the same profile and almost the same melee profile. He's got a Firestorm Great Axe, which is 5 attacks, 3s and 3s with 2 damage, but this time it's got 2 rend to help him get through armor a bit better. But he can fight twice thanks to his Battle Fury. This is only once per battle, but it lets you use 2 fight abilities, with the last one being Strike Last, so he can chuck out potentially 10 attacks in a single turn, which is quite scary. And then on top of that, he can also pick an oath in the deployment phase with Grimwrath Oaths. This gives him a bonus for the entire battle. Either I will guard them with my life, which gives him +1 to his hit rolls and also +1 to his ward rolls when he's within 6 inches of a friendly Fyreslayer hero, or he can take I will not be stopped, which gives him +1 to charge rolls and +1 to saves when he's in combat, but he loses it if he retreats or he rallies. So there's a few nice options there for him, either to get him into combat better or to just be killier when he's near other heroes, and he can do quite a bit of work. So for 110 points, I do think he is a semi-useful pick just to send towards an enemy hero that you need dead and just absolutely cleaving them in half. The Auric Flamekeeper is next. Once again, 5 health, 5 up save, with some semi-decent melee, 5 attacks, 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage, which actually isn't bad for a foot hero. And then at 130 points, he also isn't super pricey. He isn't a priest, which I find a little bit odd, but instead he's got a once per turn rule in your hero phase that lets him pick a friendly infantry unit wholly within 12 inches of him, and if any friendly units have been killed in the battle, he can roll a dice, and if the roll is less or equal to the number of units that have been destroyed, then you can give that targeted infantry unit either a 5-up ward save, +2 to their charge rolls, or +1 to their melee weapons damage. So there are 3 really good buffs there. And although this isn't likely to go off turn 1, this could easily be doable by the mid game, and just making a unit in each of your hero phases get that bonus to charge rolls or that better ward or just do some more damage is very strong, and it can really offset the pain a little bit for losing some of your units by just making one of yours that little bit stronger and more powerful each turn to really do some payback on the enemy. We aren't done yet with the heroes though, because as I said, the Fyreslayers have a lot of them. The Doomseeker is up next. He is another cheap 110 point one with the same 5-up save, 5 health and 6-up ward, with the same 5 attacks as well, with 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage thanks to his Doomseeker weapons. His rules let you pick an enemy unit as his quarry thanks to Oathbound, and he gets +1 to hit and wound them, which makes his weapons much scarier. And then on top of that, if he is in combat with his quarry when he's destroyed, you do 3 mortal damage onto that enemy unit. So even in death, he can still kill off a few infantry, or maybe kill off that injured hero or monster that you choose as his quarry. What really makes him great, I think, is that he also gets +1 to his weapon's damage if he's taken 1 damage himself, or 2 if he's taken 2 or more damage. So whilst yes, he is squishy, he can be really scary with potentially 5 attacks that are 2s and 2s, 1 rend and 4 damage when he's taken 2 damage himself. And with that profile, he can do well over 9 damage to a 4-up save, so he can potentially wipe out an entire monster or unit all by himself, which is just brilliant. And I would say he is arguably the best little anti-hero or anti-small monster torpedo unit that the Fyreslayers have to throw into the game. On the pricier side of things, we have the Grimhold Exile. He's 150 points, so a little bit pricier than the other foot heroes, but he does actually gain a health going up to 6, and also gains a pip of rend on his fire rune hammers with the same 3s and 3s and 2 damage, but 2 rend on his 5 attacks. So he is quite killy, but he's also quite a good buff piece. He gives up to 3 infantry units wholly within 12 inches of him the ability to re-roll charges once per battle in your hero phase, thanks to Honor to Grimnir, and then he can also once per battle in the combat phase do Last of the Lodge Fire, which lets you pick an enemy unit in combat with him and you roll a number of dice equal to the target's health characteristic, and on a 4+ you do 1 mortal damage to them. So on something like an 18 health Nagash, he could be doing an average of 9 damage, and then even with Nagash's 5+ ward, that is still 6 damage in total, so a full third of Nagash's health gone in one go, which, let's be honest, for a 150 point unit is pretty respectable output. Following that though, we get onto the main infantry units, and we start with the Volkite Berserkers. These come in 2 varieties with bladed sling shields and also fire steel weapons. The sling shield variant are 150 points for 10, so 15 points per model, and that gets you a 2 health, 5+ save unit with a 4-inch move and a 6+ ward. So not amazing, but also not bad for a 2 healthy unit. Their melee is a bit lackluster though. They've only got 2 attacks on 4s and 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage, so they're not super scary, but they do get Berserk Fury as a rule, which means when you die you get to roll a dice, and on a 5+ you do 1 mortal damage back onto the enemy. So they are more there to hold the line, survive a little bit, but then do some splash damage back as they get killed. The Berserkers with fire steel weapons are the slightly fightier variant. They are the same profile except only a 6+ save instead of a 5+, but they still do have those 2 attacks hitting on 4s, wounding on 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage, but they do get a bonus attack on the charge, so going up to 3 each. It's not amazing, but they are only 140 points for 10, so 140 points for 20 health and up to 30 attacks on the charge isn't awful. I mean, they're not Bladegeist Revenants, don't get me wrong, but they can get to some reasonably impressive levels of damage with all the various prayers and battle traits and formations that the Fyreslayers can bring to bear. The Auric Hearthguard are your more ranged infantry. They're still sporting the same 2 health and 6+ save, but they now come in units of 5 for 130 points, so they are a pricier 26 points per model. They have a small ranged attack with their Magma Pikes, 12-inch range, 2 shots that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and D3 damage. So it's not amazing, but the D3 damage could be nice. They could do a decent bit of damage to an enemy before they charge in or they get charged. In melee, they're only 1 attack, but they are 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage. So again, nothing super brilliant. Their shooting is made slightly better thanks to Molten Rock Bolts though. What this means is that whenever you score a critical hit with their shooting attacks, you subtract 1 inch from the enemy's movement. Now this could be nice and could stop a charge potentially, but with a 12-inch range, it's likely most things are still going to be able to make a move of up to 3 or 4 inches in their subsequent turn and then make a charge anyway. So it's definitely something, but it's maybe not something you should rely on all that much. I would say overall they're a bit mediocre. The shooting, as I said, is nice with D3 damage, but it's so short range and, hitting on 4s with only 1 rend, and the ability is just a bit meh. So I would say overall they're just not especially great, I don't think. The Hearthguard Berserkers are where things start to get a little bit better. They again have 2 profiles, the Flame Strike Poleaxes or the Berserker Broadaxes. The Poleaxes are 140 points for 5 with 2 health and a 6+ save and a 6+ ward, so they are very squishy, but they are really quite killy and also are a very good bodyguard unit. They've got 2 attacks each that are 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and they have the crit mortar rule, so they can do a solid bit of work, putting around 7 or 8 damage into a 4+ save from a min squad, but they also do some mortal damage at the end of any turn thanks to Smouldering Braziers, which lets you pick a unit they're in combat with and you roll a d3, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage to them. But on top of that, they're also really good defensively, because they bring a really nice buff in Duty Unto Death, which means if a friendly infantry hero is within their combat range, then the hero and this unit both get a 5+ ward. So it does make them that much tankier while they smash away with their poleaxes. The cheaper option is the Broadaxe variant. These are only 120 points for 5, so 24 points per model. They've got the same stat wheel and in fact keep the same defensive buff from Duty Unto Death, which is really nice. They do, however, lose the Crit Mortals rule on their axes. Instead, what they gain is the Fires of Vengeance rule, which means if they're within combat range of any damaged friendly hero, they get +1 attacks on their weapons. So they can be up to 15 attacks instead of 10, and with that same 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage, even without the crit mortals, they can still do around 9 damage to an enemy 4-up save, so they are cheaper and potentially a bit killier against some stuff, but arguably worse into heavily armoured units thanks to their lack of mortals from their weapon and their War Scroll rules. You do also have the Warcry Warband, the Vulcan Flameseekers. These guys come in a unit of 9 for 160 points, and for that you get 2 health and a 5-up save. They are a big anti-monster style unit with some actually fairly okay-ish weaponry. 8 of them have got Vulcan weapons, which are 3 attacks, which are 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 1 damage, but go up to 2 rend against monsters. And then one of them is armed with Ember Teeth, which are instead just 1 attack, again 3s and 3s, but this time with no rend, but 2 damage and the crit mortals rule. So they're not actually awful, they put out around 9 or so damage into a 4-up save profile, but then what they can also do is seriously debuff enemy monsters with their Drothmaster's rule. What this does is it lets you pick a monster they're in combat with and you roll a dice, and on a 3+, you then get to roll a d3, and you subtract that from the monster's damage characteristic on their companion weapons. So potentially dropping all of those scary 2 or 3 or 4 damage claw and teeth attacks from the monsters in the game down to just 1. And this is a really huge hit on a lot of monsters' damage output, so they're really not bad. I would say they're maybe not a must take, but if you know your opponent has a fair few monsters in them and you want a good, annoying little monster hunter style unit, they could be worth taking. Finally, we get to the manifestations, and there are 3 of them: the Molten Infernoth, the Runic Firewall, and the Zargron Flamespitter. The Infernoth is a solid 10 health with a 5-up save and a 6-up ward, and a great 8-inch move for this army. It has an okay shooting attack with 2 shots at 8 inches that are 4s and 3s, 2 rend and d3 damage, and then in melee it can swing with 6 attacks, again 4s to hit but now 2s to wound, with 1 rend, d3 damage and the crit mortals rule, so it can put out a fair bit of hurt into combat. It also gets the Flame Scarred rule, which means at the end of any turn you can pick an enemy unit that was damaged by your Infernoth and you subtract 1 from their wound rolls until the end of your next turn. So this could potentially stick around for your opponent and your turns and make an enemy unit much weaker into your Fyreslayers. So I think this is a really nice little manifestation. It also looks awesome, which I think is a big important thing to consider. The Runic Firewall is a more simple one. It's 8 health with a 3-up save. It can't move, but what it does with its roaring rune fire is let you pick 3 enemy units within 6 inches of it, and you roll a d3 for each, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage to them, and they also lose 3 control until the end of the turn. So a great way to defend an objective, doing some splash mortals around it, and also making it that much harder for your opponent to take it from you. The last one is the Zargon Flamespitter. This is more of a shooting summon. It's only 5 health and a 6-up save, so it is very squishy, but it does have a solid 18-inch range, and it fires 8 shots that are 4s and 3s with 1 rend, 1 damage, and it has the crit 2 hits rule. So you can really spike this and get quite a lot of hits into the enemy. You also get to add 1 to hit rolls for its shooting attacks if you are targeting an enemy unit that's got 10 or more models, or adding +1 to hit and +1 to wound if the enemy unit has 15 or more models. So with that rule, Magma Blast, you can do a lot of work into those big hordes of things like zombies and skeletons. You could potentially be hitting on 3s, wounding on 2s, and then just obliterating a good chunk of a squad quite easily. The final thing of note for the Fyreslayers is their terrain piece, the Magmic Battleforge. This is 8 health and a 3-up save and a 6-up ward, as you would expect. It allows you to pick a priest unit within its combat range in your hero phase. Once per battle, they can use the power of the forge to heal d3 to every Fyreslayer's unit on the battlefield, which is pretty damn amazing as a huge army-wide heal in the late game. Once you've done this though, you then can't use its other ability, which is Molten Blessing. This ability, which is done at the start of any turn, lets you pick a priest, again within the Battleforge's combat range, and they get +1 to their chanting rolls for the rest of the turn, and they can also unbind one as though they were a wizard. So I think in general this terrain piece is great for just putting a priest there, getting off some good prayers early on and also unbinding some enemy spells, and then as the battle drags on and you start taking damage, then unleashing the forge and healing up a big chunk of your army ready to fight and get into combat all over again. So it's a really fun, quite powerful little terrain feature, and I do think it's definitely worth bringing along just to add some better chanting and some unbinding and some healing to your army. So that is it for the Fyreslayers. I do think they've obviously got a very limited range, but to me it does seem quite strong. I really do like their battle traits and their formations, and whilst their units are very much glass cannons, especially their infantry units, they can really hit quite hard with all the various buffs and abilities and bonuses that you can give them. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of the Fyreslayers. Let me know which of the formations you like the most. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me. But until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.